Prior to Valve's successes outside of game development, their first attempt at making a game was Half-Life. And unlike most people's first time, this wasn't a terrible experience. It lasted a little longer than expected and got progressively harder as it went. But playing a game like Half-Life for the first time 2 decades after its release can hinder your enjoyment a bit. Because of how prevalent the Half-Life story has become in the gaming space, the same wonder that people had originally for this new world is spoiled for new players, especially because the story relies quite heavily on that sense of mystery and discovery. So on its face, Half-Life does not tell a deep or moving story. Instead, it unravels a sequence of events that are a part of a much larger picture. A picture that becomes a lot clearer the deeper you go into the game and its future installments. But keeping our focus on Half-Life 1, even with its simple and straightforward linear narrative structure, one thing that this game does remarkably well, even for today's standards, is environmental storytelling. This game shows you its story more than it does tell it. And the opening sequence is a perfect example of that. The environment poses questions to the player without the player even knowing it at the time, just for those questions to be answered at a later time in equally subtle ways. The game doesn't spoon feed a bunch of exposition, it allows the player to make these observations and wonder, something that most modern games are afraid to do nowadays. But what even is the story? Without the artsy fartsy stuff, well, that's the easy question to answer. You play as Gordon Freeman, a Black Mesa scientist, and you partake in a science experiment gone wrong that opens a portal to a different dimension. And it's your job to close that portal to prevent an alien invasion. As simple as it sounds, the depth is found between the lines. With every interaction, the motivations are slowly revealed to the player, putting all prior events into perspective. A perspective that can influence the player's actions at the end of the game. But before we reach the end, let's jump back to the beginning. And probably the biggest mistake that I made before playing this game was not playing the tutorial, and also setting the difficulty to hard. These choices come back to haunt me later on, but before that, the game opens with a nice and slow introduction that gives you a feel for the pace of the game as you make your way in this trolley and then from room to room. After the opening sequence, you're introduced to Gordon's everyday life at this facility. The levels give you the freedom to traverse openly with a few loading screens, but openly nonetheless. You get no real direction or indicators on where to go aside from subtle environmental context clues throughout each level. This lack of direction does become a bit of an issue at times, and the introduction of the crowbar is a small example of that. The idea is that you're supposed to grab the crowbar and then you break the glass from the door in front of you. You're given no indication that you can actually do this. It's possible that I'm just an idiot and it was obvious what I was supposed to do in that moment, but this happens multiple times after, where the lack of visual cues or indicators actually make you lose direction. Another moment for me was during the first boss encounter. You know you have to turn on the fan and the fuel pump, indicated by the control room. So I did that. I turned on the fuel pump and turned on the fan, but the control room still disagreed. It indicated that the fuel pump wasn't on, even though it was. Well, turns out it wasn't on, because what I actually had to do was jump into the fan, which would then shoot me in the air into the vents, which would then lead me to the fuel pump to then turn it on. But the problem is that there was no indication that the fan would fly me up into the vent. Mind you, up to this point in the game, this mechanic hadn't been introduced yet anywhere else. A simple wind particle indicator could have fixed this issue by showing the player the flow direction in this level. Now, it is possible that, once again, I'm just an idiot, but things like this kept happening throughout the game, that the freedom the game gave you started to hurt the experience a lot more. Having to backtrack a significant amount because you missed a switch gets annoying after the third or fourth time. It also doesn't help that some of these buttons and switches don't even look like interactable objects. Once again, there are no indicators to tell the player that you can interact. These small oversights irritate the hell out of me, because the rest of the game is so much better than this that it surprises me that these seemingly tiny details were overlooked. Speaking of which, the rest of the game is honestly impressive, especially considering the fact that this game came out in 1998. You can tell that the design philosophy for modern first-person shooters started with Half-Life. It's a lot more narrative driven than most, if not all, FPS games of the time. Its focus on puzzles rather than action is a welcome change. While games like Doom treat boss fights as bullet sponges, Half-Life's approach is more like solving a puzzle. It also puts you, the player, into perspective. You're not an unstoppable force like Doom guy, you're just a regular guy with a power suit, and because of that, it makes sense why this game is significantly more difficult than all other first-person shooters of this time. Even on medium difficulty, the game checks you at every encounter. This leads me to talk about the enemies. With the variety of enemies in the game, you are forced to adapt to their behavior on the fly, especially when you have different enemy classes clashing with one another. You're able to hide off to the side while the alien forces wipe out the military to then clear out the remaining enemies with a minimal amount of ammo and minimal damage taken. Being able to strategize like this is what makes this game different to most shooters. These facilities feel lived in when you have different types of enemies that act differently towards you and towards one another. The only enemy that I didn't like encountering were the female Black Ops soldier, because not only are they extremely agile and you're not, they can also go invisible. Not only is it hard to shoot them because they're quick on their feet, it's also hard to shoot them because you can't see them. It's the only enemy that felt unfair because you're not given the proper tools to deal with an enemy like that. Grenades are too slow, the assault rifle is too inaccurate, and the pistols are just too weak. But the real issue is that you just can't see them because they go invisible, and you're not given any tool to counteract that ability. That being said, I do like that you are given a number of weapons throughout the game that you can experiment with when dealing with the various enemies. Each gun feels distinct from one another, even if they fall within the same class type. Introducing alien tech to your arsenal was also a great way to keep the gameplay from becoming boring and stale. Each of these weapons are introduced in ways that contextually make sense, which helps expand on the lore of the game. Military-grade weapons are found near military establishments, and experimental tech weapons are found in science labs, along with alien tech that is being experimented on. Many of these weapons also have a secondary firing mode, allowing for two different approaches without having to swap and cycle through your arsenal. And some of these guns actually have a better secondary mode, while others work best in conjunction. The assault rifle is a perfect example of that. Its regular firing mode, along with its grenade launcher, is probably one of the best and most effective combinations in the entire game. You clear out the bigger enemies with the grenade launcher, and then you mop up the rest. In my opinion, a perfect gameplay loop for a first-person shooter. But just because the shooting is perfect, that doesn't mean that the rest of the game is as well. My biggest complaint with this game is the absolutely atrocious, clunky, slippery ass, floaty ass, Scooby-Doo running in place ass, walk around like I'm on ice ass movement control.
Now we can get out of here.
You walk around like you're on skates, you jump and you have zero maneuverability, and the thing that makes this even worse is how much platforming you have to do in this game. It feels like every level has that one platforming section where you end up battling the controls more than the actual enemies, and the Zen levels are perfect examples of that. These levels are the worst because of the platforming. It's literally all platforming, but it's so hard to gauge the distance between platforms because of how slippery the game is that once you're in the air, you have to commit to the trajectory with zero way to maneuver or course correct. It also doesn't help that object collision can be super inconsistent at times. You get stuck in geometry constantly, while other times you're slipping and sliding off platforms, and it gets even worse when a lot of the platforming has to be super precise. So most of the time, you just end up dead or tilted. But some of the things that I really enjoyed about this game was actually the visuals. Considering this game is a 1998 release, the graphics are actually pretty impressive. I appreciate the texture variety because it gives each level a unique look and feel to them. From facilities, desert bases, military bunkers, underwater levels, to completely alien worlds that you're transported to. All of these rooms are designed in a way that they tell a story, like flooded rooms with exposed wires that require you to shut down the power to walk across it, and open air desert environments with active minefields surrounded by military bunkers. Given that context, you're able to piece together that short and quick story of those NPCs in that level. I did, however, mention underwater levels, and as expected, they're absolutely atrocious, but mostly because, again, the controls. The ground controls are bad, but the water controls are even more infuriating with how imprecise the movement is. It feels like you're in a constant state of slip and sliding, and the giant fish only makes these levels even worse. I love the puzzles. Most of them are very clever, and once you figure them out, you realize how smart they really are, but traversing them is the problem. And that's the same issue that I had with some of the boss fights, especially the final boss. And I hate that I have to end on a negative note, but the final boss was the most confusing encounter in the entire game. There's no real context clues given to the player on how to defeat the boss. On top of that, an issue that I had with pretty much every enemy in the game is that there's no real feedback given to the player when you or the enemy has taken damage. You usually expect some enemy kickback or recoil or blood splatter, but you don't get any of that. And this became a huge problem during the final boss because you can't tell if the boss is taking damage or not. On top of that, for the entire game, you're conditioned to think that the way to defeat a boss is not by shooting at it directly, but rather by using the environment against it. And this is why I enjoyed the game so much. I loved this different approach. So turning the final boss into a bullet sponge, practically, it betrays all the rules that the game had set up with the earlier encounters. As frustrating as all these things are, I can't help but think that it's just a product of its time. It was a first of its kind, it was trying something new, so there was no real blueprint to follow. Even with that, Valve was still able to create precedents that modern FPS games are expected to meet. It was a first attempt at something new, and not many games have been able to do that since.